am going to be reading from chapter 9 from our A Rendezvous with Colorado History. Chapter 9 titled War. This is the reading for Thursday, April 9th. It was a beautiful Monday morning. Mr. Brown's students were outside waiting for the first bell to ring. They talked excitedly about what they had done that weekend. Finally, the bell rang. Mr. Brown let the students in and they began to settle in their seats. Suddenly, Yancey shouted, "Hey, Mr. Brown, someone has been into the things in my desk." "Someone has moved all my stuff around," exclaimed Abigail. "Some of my stuff is missing," cried Keith. "And my pencils are missing," added Kelsey. "I know," said Mr. Brown. "I needed some pencils and things, so I just helped myself." "But those were our things," said Kelsey. "Why would you just come in and take our stuff?" "How does this make you feel?" Mr. Brown asked. "I don't think you should be able to just come and take our stuff," said Kevin. "But I'm the teacher," said Mr. Brown with a shrug. "I can do what I want." "You can't take things that don't belong to you," said Gianna. "Why do you do this?" asked Tim. "I wanted you to see what it would be like for someone to take your things." "Why?" asked Maria. "I just wanted you to know what the American Indians might have felt like. As we have seen, the trappers, traders, and earlier explorers usually got along with the Indians. The Indians were trading for items like metal tools and guns that made their lives easier. But as more and more settlers came into Colorado, many problems developed. We have been talking about some of the problems between the settlers and the Indians. The settlers had been taking over the American Indian land. They had begun to settle in the Indian hunting grounds. They were putting up fences. This was hard for the Indians to understand. They were becoming angry with the settlers. You became upset when you saw that someone had taken your things. Just think how angry you would feel if someone came and tried to take your home away from you. The settlers were also bringing diseases like cholera. The Indians had never been exposed to these diseases. It was very difficult for them. In one summer, nearly half the Cheyenne died from cholera. "I read that the settlers were also killing lots of buffalo," Adam said. They would just take the tongue and leave the meat to rot. I'll bet that made the Indians mad." "You're right," agreed Mr. Brown. "As you know, the buffalo was important to the Indians. It was very hard for them to see the settlers waste this food. What else might have caused problems?" "The miners were coming on their land to search for gold," said Kate. "Yes," Mr. Brown nodded. "The United States government had signed treaties with the Indians. They promised to give the Indians special areas they called reservations. They said that they would leave the Indians alone as long as they stayed on the reservations. At first, this worked out fine, and then the government began to break their promises. The settlers would find that there were more gold on the reservation, or that it was good farmland. They would get the government to make the reservation smaller so they could have this good land. Pretty soon, the Indian reservations were getting smaller and smaller. Indians were having a hard time finding food. The government promised to bring them food. Once again, these promises were broken." "How could they do that to the Indians?" asked Brian. "Why was the government always breaking its promises?" "It was a terrible thing," continued Mr. Brown. "The Indians wondered the same thing. They could not trust the settlers. It is sad to say they began to hate all the settlers. They were angry and wanted to get back some of the things that were taken away from them. They needed food and supplies. Some of them began to kill in order to get what they needed. Indians who had fought against each other were now working together to fight the settlers. The settlers became afraid of all Indians. Some would shoot any Indian they saw. Everyone was scared and many wanted revenge. What happened is that many innocent people lost their lives." "I didn't know that the settlers had been so mean to the Indians," said Brink. "There were lots of broken promises," said Mr. Brown. "The settlers and the government did not understand the Indians, and the Indians did not understand them. Many people began to fight to get what they wanted. Just like in any war, there were bad things happening on both sides. Let me tell you about some of these conflicts." Now I'm reading the section Plains Indians. At first, the Plains Indians tried to get along with the new settlers. They believed the promises made to them by the United States government. They had been told the plains would be their hunting ground forever. When the city of Denver was being built, many of the Indians camped nearby so they could watch. Most of them became friends with the settlers. As time passed, the buffalo were quickly being killed by the people traveling west. There were fewer and fewer buffalo for Indians to hunt. The Indians were becoming angry because they could not get enough food. Some of them began to raid ranches. They would kill or steal cattle and horses. Some would attack wagon trains headed west. Sometimes pioneers would be killed during these raids. Most of the attacks were done by just a few young warriors. During this time, there was a war going on back east between the northern and southern sections of the United States. Most of the soldiers were called away from Colorado to fight in the Civil War, so they were not there to protect the settlers. John Evans was the governor of Colorado Territory at this time. He ordered all of the Indians to move to the army forts. He told them that if they gave up their weapons, he would provide them with food. He then said that any Indian who did not move to the army forts would be considered hostile or unfriendly. Settlers were given permission to shoot any hostile Indians. Winter was approaching. The Indians knew that it would be hard to find food in the water, so most of the Indians agreed to move to the forts. They camped near Fort Lyon by Sand Creek. They thought they would be safe because they had done what had been asked. They were wrong. Sand Creek Massacre. Many of the settlers did not believe the Indians wanted to live in peace. They believed that all the Indians should be feared and punished. John Chivington was a minister and a soldier. He asked men to join to fight the Indians. Chivington wanted to battle to punish the Arapaho and the Cheyenne. He said he and his men traveled to Sand Creek. Isn't that where the Indians were camped? Asked Joe. That's right, answered Mr. Brown. On the morning of November 29, 1864, Chivington and his men attacked the Indian camp. It is said that Chivington told his men not to take any prisoners. The Indians were caught off guard. Most did not have any weapons. Black Kettle, the chief of the village, stood waving an American flag. Why was he waving the flag? Wondered Lindsay. He was hoping that the soldiers would realize that they were making a mistake, said Mr. Brown. It didn't do any good. It is said the soldiers killed between 200 to 500 Indians. Different people said different things. No one really knows for sure how many people were killed, but most of them were women, children, and older men. Did all the Indians die? Asked Paul. No, replied Mr. Brown. Most of the ones who survived were sent to a reservation in present-day Oklahoma. Some of the younger warriors did not go. They began to attack settlers. They burned stagecoach stations and towns. Telegraph lines were torn down. In 1865, the Civil War ended. The Colorado soldiers who had been fighting in the Civil War returned home. They continued to chase and fight the warriors, who were still fighting for a way of life. Eventually, these Indians were either killed or went in the reservation. What happened to Black Kettle? Wondered Kelly. Amazingly, Black Kettle was not killed in the Sand Creek Massacre. He even continued to try to work for peace between the settlers and the Indians. About 4 years later, he was killed when a cavalry troop led by George Armstrong Custer attacked his village. Black Kettle's village was attacked even though they were camped on an Indian land with the white flag and American flag flying to show that they were peaceful. That is terrible, exclaimed Zach. I can't believe the soldiers attacked the Indians like that. They just wanted to live in peace. It was a terrible thing, agreed Mr. Brown. What happened to Chivington after the Sand Creek Massacre? Asked Chelsea. It's amazing to know that many of the settlers considered Chivington a hero, answered Mr. Brown. The United States government finally looked into Sand Creek tragedy and found Chivington guilty of leading a massacre. Was he punished for what he did? Asked Michael. Not really, although he did pay a price for what he did. At one point in time, many people thought that he would become the first congressman of Colorado. His punishment was that he couldn't be involved in politics or in Colorado's fight for statehood. He was also forced to resign from the Colorado Militia, which is like the military. He moved around and worked different jobs until he died from cancer in 1892. All right, that's where we're going to stop for today. Tomorrow we're going to continue reading the rest of the chapter and answer some of those questions at the end. But that's all we have for reading today.